Hey everybody, here we are talking about the Deep Philosophies. I call them the Deep Philosophies. It's kind of a little game I like to play. To me, this is just touchy-feely stuff, the stuff that gets a little bit wacky. Fact is, though, that in Western, see, in my training, all right, in my training, empiricism and rationalism play heavy emphasis. It's really, as I'll describe on the very last slide when I get down to it, it's really in counseling and psychoanalysis that these philosophies have really taken hold or still have influence. So to me, I call them the deep philosophies with deep in quote meaning wacky. No, I don't mean wacky. I mean the deep thinkers. I guess I don't know. We'll see. The more I study them, the more I start to see a few things in here that are worth while, because some of it does overlap with some of my research. But trust me when I tell you, um, my type of experimentally based psychology doesn't really draw upon this branch of philosophy. All right, Enlightenment was the age of reason, right, which came directly out of the Renaissance, a period during which Western philosophy embraced the belief that an unbiased reason or the objective methods of science could reveal the principles governing the universe. We talked about humans are mechanistic, humans are machines, determinism. I mean, we've had this all together. Once you discover these principles that govern the universe, they can be used to better humankind. I mean, this is a wonderful Enlightenment thinking. It created it created the in the U.S. Constitution, the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights comes directly out of the Enlightenment, okay? It was, in fact, when Thomas Jefferson was sitting there writing the Declaration of Independence, and then later on, James Madison was writing the Constitution, they clearly had the Bible next to them, but they also had the works of John Locke next to them, okay? Because John Locke he did a lot of influence on this, and this is what the Enlightenment was about. But at the same time that the philosophies of rationalism and empiricism were rising, there was these other off to the side philosophies, romanticism and existentialism, which are strongly related philosophies, technically different, but strongly related. So romanticism is that philosophy that stresses the uniqueness of each person, rather than these fundamental rules or fundamental principles, I believe is what we used on the last slide. Rather than these fundamental principles, it stresses the uniqueness, okay? It says you're more than just a bunch of rules. You are full of irrationality and unpredictability, and these are good things, okay? That you as a natural creature are good, all right? And this, in fact, goes all the way back if in Diogenes was one of the which of those philosophers was he? The Damn, I don't remember. One of them other Greek philosophers, and I can't remember. But anyway, Diogenes emphasized this to begin with. Remember, he said, look, anything natural is good. By definition is good. It is only once you start to bring in the human beings that things get bad. If memory serves, back in that presentation, I mentioned, all of the negative emotions of anger and jealousy, these can only exist when other human beings are present. Without other human beings, these negative emotions cannot exist. The Romantics emphasized notions such as the resolution of conflict, that is to say, controlling our animal urges, okay? We have to resolve the emotional difficulties of being human. This is an interesting concept, this resolution of conflict, because it sounds an awful lot like id versus superego. But even in my line of research, I must admit that this resolution of conflict plays a major role, being that I study self-control and self-regulation, and I'm finding it more and more to the point that, by definition, we have an animalistic nature that is a gimme, 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 God forbid we'll call it an id, and this gimme, gimme, gimme needs to be regulated, and we need to learn those mechanisms or societal mechanisms which allow us to control those urges, okay? But the Romantics also emphasize this self-actualization. What's his name? Nietzsche's going to call it Superman or something, but this concept that we have to move towards fulfillment, towards the good life, or as we perhaps are familiar with Maslow again, the self-actualized person that has found their calling or something of this nature. But it also emphasizes unconscious processes, those things that we're not aware of that also govern our actions. Okay, all of these principles are ones which you're going to find heavily in Freudian thinking as well. Okay. Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the ultimate loser, by the way, as far as a personal life guy. Holy balls. He had like 9 kids from 9 different women or something. I don't know what it was. The dude just abandoned people. He was a horrible person. Whatever. So he has this concept that human beings, when they're born, are noble. They're noble. They're perfect. And in some ways, if you didn't contaminate them by existence in human society, they would somehow be perfect. Okay, and so at one point, around 1780 or something, they found this kid on the top right corner of the slide, Victor of Avignon, the wild boy of Avignon, and Victor they found running around in the woods, and Rousseau and other romantic thinkers of the time felt that in some ways that Victor was somehow going to be perfect. Okay, he was this perfection. Fact is, Victor was almost more animal than he was human, and no matter how hard people tried, they never really civilized him. He never really wanted to wear clothes. He never learned to talk. He did not really want to ever become human. Okay? And so, Schopenhauer. Okay? Schopenhauer, he argued that we all have a will to survive, a powerful need to perpetuate your life by satisfying your biological needs. Okay? And that these irrational forces, these biological needs, these blind, aimless forces, pain is caused by an unsatisfied need and causes us to act to satisfy the need. Yeah, we'll talk more motivation later, okay? I promise you this concept of self-actualization, and in fact, when we get to the chapter on humanistic psychology, there's going to be a presentation titled Motivation 101. Okay, so when we satisfy a need, we feel pleasure until a new need arises. I mean, we're gonna talk about Motivation 101. Again, according to Schopenhauer, life is just nothing more than the postponement of death. Okay, ultimately death wins, and this is kind of a depressing thought. People cling to life not because they like life, but because they fear death. Yeah, lovely. Thank you, Schopenhauer. You really put it in perspective. But Schopenhauer also emphasized the importance of the unconscious mind, right? Because humans have both rational and animalistic impulses. Consciousness is the mere surface of our mind, and of this, as of the globe, we do not know the interior, but only the crust. Doesn't it sound like this quote could have come from Sigmund Freud about 75 to 100 years later? He had discussions of repressing undesirable thoughts, using resistances when these thoughts would try to come to the surface. I know, I hate Freud bashing, but what do you want from me? This stuff just writes itself. A related philosophy, related to the Romantics, is the existential philosophy. Now, the existential philosophy is at the core, and I mean, if you were to take a psychology course, let's say a general psychology. In fact, I've always thought that it would be an interesting exercise to take a general psychology course from a European university. You would find that the material would be almost unrecognizable because from the psychology in America is so much oriented towards empiricism and rationalism blending together to form science. You'd find that existentialism formed a much larger part of the European tradition of psychology. But existentialism is a philosophy that examines the meaning in life and stresses the freedom that humans have to choose their own destiny. Oh, Lord. Like Romanticism, existentialism stresses subjective experience and the uniqueness of each individual. Okay, this stuff makes me feel freaky, but existentialism forms the basis of humanistic psychology, which we will definitely spend some time talking about coming up into that show. One of the biggest existentialists was Kierkegaard. I like this name, Soren. I could never pronounce it, but I love it. Okay, he was in Denmark. Not too many philosophers coming out of Denmark, but he says, look, I mean, Denmark is a Protestant nation. All right, we've rejected the Catholic Church. But guess what happened? They rejected the Catholic Church and they slipped right back in. Okay? Clergy became civil servants, the state controlled religion, and I mean that was one of the reasons that they were rejecting it in the first place. And he said too many Christians were praying just reflexively, which was again, I mean, the entire point of the Protestant Revolution, Reformation rather, Protestant Revolution, was that the people who were going to church and they couldn't even understand. Remember that whole everything is in Latin stuff, and you couldn't even understand it, even if you could get a copy. Well, it was the same thing. People were just taking it rather than understanding it and accepting it. And he said, look, you can't really teach truth, okay, using logical argument or something. You have to experience it. So the more you try to understand God using logic, the less you actually understand God, okay? You can only understand him through faith, okay? You must just accept him. Hey, buddy, I did you. There. Then we got a little bit of Nietzsche. Not a whole lot of Nietzsche, just a little bit of Nietzsche, because Nietzsche is freaky, man. He said there's two aspects to human nature, the Apollonian and the Dionysian. Okay? The Apollonian seeks order, tranquility, and predictability. Think superego. The Dionysian part seeks chaos, adventure, and passionate experience. Think id, right? The best of art and literature reflect a fusion of these two, okay? Chaos without order equals holy crap, and order without chaos, a little bit of chaos in it is boring, boring, boring. So the best life reflects a controlled balance. I don't know what it says I can't tell what it says under my face, but I bet you it says something like the best life reflects a controlled balance between reasoning and passion. The goal in Nietzschean philosophy, psychology, okay, he was a psychologist in some ways before psychology was born, help the individual gain control of their powerful, irrational impulses and live creative and healthy lives. Sounds an awful lot like the humanistic psychologists we're going to talk about, to get control of your animal urges and etc. So the Dionysian tendency, if left uncontrolled, would destroy us. Dionysian expression is always modified by... Okay, so, yeah, in other words, people go crazy. Okay. So here's what he says. Humans need to acquire knowledge about themselves, then act on that knowledge. This self-knowledge that he's referring to, again, forms the core of humanistic therapy. Okay, self-examination reveals the most basic human motive, which is, of course, the will to power. Yeah, it sounds like the life instincts that we refer to in Freudian thought. The basic human need to become stronger, more complete, more superior. Will to power also reminds me, obviously, of self-actualization, to become, to find your purpose, to do what you're supposed to do. And the will to power will ultimately cause people to seek new experiences to reach a potential. Okay? Such growth cannot be impeded by conventional morality. I don't remember what that means. But anyway, those people that have the courage to rise above conventional morality and herd conformity and follow their inclinations can become Superman or Ubermensch, something like higher man or Superman. The Superman concept was twisted. See, this Superman concept was twisted by the Nazis for their purposes. But what this Superman seems to be is much more related to, as we've said, the self-actualization. Those individuals that have the courage to rise above conventional morality, to do what needs to be done, follow their own instincts, go where they need to be. In other words, don't be afraid. This would be the core concept behind, say, for example, Abraham Maslow's Jonah complex that we'll get to later as well. This idea of fear of destiny or something like that. If you can overcome that, you become Superman or self-actualized person or something. So it's clearly the basis of that type of psychology coming out. And so here's our three basic breakdowns on philosophy. We've got the empiricism, the rationalism and the romanticism as our three breakdowns or three types of philosophy. And where do they find themselves most heavily? Empirical philosophy finds itself most heavily in modern experimental psychology, in particular in behaviorism, because of its reductionistic principles and laws of association that they emphasized. The rationalists are much more in the cognitive psychology because we study the mind experimentally, but we recognize that shit happens. Shit happens, especially in the realm of sensation and perception. We find that the Gestalt psychologists and the Gestalt organizing principles are still used quite heavily when in modern cognitive psychology. And then the romanticism and existentialism we'd be much more likely to find in modern humanistic psychology and psychoanalysis. So the point of these three lectures in a row is that though we don't really think about philosophy as anything, the point is everything in modern psychological thinking comes from someplace else, comes from these early philosophers, okay? So next time we get to finally move on away from philosophy and move into the psychophysics, we're one chapter off of Psychology is Born, okay? Psychology will be born in one more chapter, but we got one more chapter because it turns out that psychology is going to be the blending of physiology and philosophy. That's what our next unit is going to be about. So I'll see you then.